It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, golden streaks across the hardwood floors of our home. Jareth Calloway had returned from another long day at the office, the weight of meetings, deadlines, and minor frustrations pressing down on him. He had been looking forward to a quiet evening with Selah, his wife of 7 years, a marriage that had settled into a rhythm of familiarity, comfort, and predictable domesticity. The kind of life that, while steady, left little room for surprise or excitement. As he stepped through the front door, the faint aroma of her cooking mingled with the lingering scent of polished wood and the faint hint of coffee still cooling in the mug on the counter. He exhaled, attempting to shake off the day, anticipating the casual chatter that would fill the evening. But then, something on the kitchen counter caught his eye: Selah's phone, left carelessly face up, a soft glow emanating from the screen. At first, he hesitated, telling himself that he should not intrude, that whatever was on that screen was none of his concern at the moment. But curiosity, sharp and insistent, edged out reason. Jareth picked up the phone, his fingers trembling slightly, and unlocked it. The message that appeared made his chest tighten, an instant cold spike of dread racing through his veins. The sender was a name he did not recognize: Thorne Kincaid. The words on the screen were unmistakably intimate, impossibly close: "Can't wait for tonight, my love." Time seemed to distort in that instant. The familiar warmth of his home became alien, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. Jareth's heartbeat skipped, then raced uncontrollably. He felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him, leaving him in a free-fall of disbelief and betrayal. He stared at the screen as though the words might somehow vanish if he ignored them, but they remained, unyielding and accusatory. Every ounce of his previous trust, every shared smile, every quiet moment of contentment with Selah, now felt like fragile glass shattered by a single, devastating blow. He tried to steady himself, inhaling deeply, attempting to reconcile the domestic calm he had entered with the storm raging inside. 100 thoughts collided, each more painful than the last. How long had this been going on? Why him? What had he done, or not done, to allow this space for someone else? And then there was the image of Thorne, an unknown man whose presence now loomed over the sanctuary of his home, as if he had been quietly waiting for this moment all along. When Selah walked through the door moments later, Jareth felt a cold clarity settle over him. Her face, usually open and warm, now carried a subtle tension, a tightness around the eyes and lips that he had not seen before. She moved with measured calm, placing her purse on the counter, her gaze briefly meeting his before darting away. He could see it in her eyes, a flicker of hesitation, a shadow of guilt perhaps, but it was not the flood of remorse he had imagined in the worst scenarios that had played out in his mind. "Selah, what is this?" he asked, voice low but firm, his hand subtly lifting the phone. His chest was heavy, but his tone demanded honesty. There was no trembling in his words, no hysterics, just a quiet insistence for the truth. Selah froze, her shoulders stiffening as if bracing against some invisible force. Then, with a calmness that chilled him more than any outburst could have, she met his gaze and admitted it. She had been seeing someone else, a man she described with a reverence that stung more than the betrayal itself. Thorne Kincaid, she said, was strong, thrilling, alpha. The word hung in the air like a hammer striking steel, reverberating through the core of Jareth's understanding of his life, his marriage, and himself. Jareth felt a hollow ache spread through him, a combination of disbelief, anger, and sorrow that he had never known. He could hardly process the words, yet each one struck with precision, cutting through the very foundation of trust he had built over 7 years. He sat down on the edge of the counter, the world narrowing to a painful focus on her, on Thorne, and on the unalterable reality of the moment. This was not just infidelity, it was a revelation that would force him to confront not only his wife and her choices but also the man he thought he was, and the life he had assumed was safe, secure, and predictable. The kitchen, once a place of quiet domesticity, now felt like the stage for an unfolding drama, a confrontation that had been silently waiting in the shadows. The soft ticking of the clock seemed unnaturally loud, marking each second of this new, altered reality. Jareth's mind raced, yet beneath the chaos, a spark of resolve began to kindle, a determination not merely to react, but to reclaim control, to redefine the narrative of his life in a way that no betrayal could dismantle. He realized, in that long, heavy moment, that everything had changed, and yet, paradoxically, he felt the first stirring of a new awareness, that strength, true strength, might be something more than brute force, more than dominance. It was in resilience, intelligence, and the unyielding will to rise, even when the foundation of his world seemed to crumble beneath him. Selah stood there for a moment, the weight of Jareth's gaze pressing down on her like a tangible force. She seemed smaller somehow, as if the house itself had shrunk to reflect the gravity of the moment. The phone still lay on the counter between them, a silent witness to everything that had transpired. Jareth's fingers hovered near it, not touching, but poised, as though he could extract further truths from its glowing screen with a mere gesture. His eyes, usually soft and forgiving, were now sharp, piercing, demanding the honesty he had long believed their marriage was built upon. "I need you to be completely honest with me," Jareth said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging beneath the surface. There was no accusation, no bitterness laced in his tone, just an insistence for clarity. Selah's hands, usually so expressive in conversation, were now clasped tightly together, knuckles white, her nails digging shallow furrows into her palms. She swallowed hard, a faint tremor passing through her lips as if she were summoning courage from some hidden reservoir. I have been seeing someone else," she admitted finally, her words deliberate, measured. There was no hysteria, no desperate pleading for forgiveness. Just a stark, cold admission that cut through the silence like a blade. Jareth felt a jolt, a sudden hollow ache that settled deep in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. The shock was undeniable, but he knew that any display of uncontrolled emotion would only give her, and this other man, the power to manipulate the narrative. Selah's eyes flickered nervously toward the floor before meeting his briefly, and in that fleeting connection, Jareth saw both regret and defiance. She continued, her voice soft but resolute. "His name is Thorne Kincaid. He's different from you. Stronger, more, exciting. I didn't mean to hurt you, but I can't ignore how he makes me feel." The word alpha lingered in her tone, and it struck Jareth with an almost physical force. He had heard the term before in passing, in conversations about dominant personalities or primal traits, but here it was, loaded with meaning, something intangible that she seemed to crave, something he ostensibly lacked. Jareth leaned against the counter, keeping his posture relaxed but his mind alert. He felt the old versions of himself, the forgiving, complacent husband, pressing for a reaction, but he pushed them aside. "Explain," he said simply, voice calm, almost clinical. "I want to understand exactly what you mean." He wasn't asking to judge or to argue, he needed the facts, the raw truth, to process the scope of the betrayal. Selah exhaled sharply, a sound of both relief and tension. "It's not just physical, Jareth. It's the energy he has. The confidence, the dominance. It's intoxicating, and I felt alive with him in a way I don't feel with you anymore. I know it sounds cruel, but I can't lie about how I feel. I've tried, I've really tried, but I can't." Each word was a hammer to the foundation of their life together. Jareth could feel it pressing down on him, threatening to collapse the world he had painstakingly built. And yet, beneath the initial shock, beneath the betrayal, a strange clarity began to emerge. He understood now that the pain was real, the wound deep, but it was not the end. "Not yet. You think this is about being stronger than me?" he asked, tone even, almost detached. "That by calling him an alpha, you found some truth that I somehow lack?" Selah flinched at the words, not because of anger, but because there was no anger there, no judgment to deflect or argue with. Just the quiet precision of someone assessing the situation, gathering information. Jareth's mind raced, not with retaliation, not with vengeance, but with analysis. He observed Selah's mannerisms, the slight tightening of her jaw, the nervous flicker of her eyes, the way her hands moved as she spoke. Every detail, he realized, was a clue, not to her, but to himself, to the dynamics that had allowed this fissure to grow unnoticed. The betrayal was not just her actions, it was the complacency he had allowed in their marriage, the comfort that had dulled his edge, the subtle letting go of the spark that once defined him. He straightened, his voice calm but filled with a quiet intensity. "Selah, I'm listening. But understand this, I am not weak. I have been the steady one, the one who built and nurtured, the one who chose when to fight. And now, I choose to fight, not with fists, but with clarity, with intelligence, with strategy." Selah's eyes widened slightly, caught between surprise and apprehension. There was no theatrics in his declaration, no dramatic flair, just an unyielding assertion of self. Jareth felt a moment of something he hadn't expected, not empowerment derived from revenge, but empowerment born from resolve. He had been blindsided, yes, but he was no longer vulnerable in the same way. The dynamic had shifted, and he was now the one defining the terms of engagement, even if Selah could not see it yet. For a long moment, the two of them stood in silence, the weight of their shared history pressing down like an unspoken language. Then Selah spoke again, quieter this time, almost apologetically. "I didn't mean to. I don't know how it happened, Jareth. I didn't plan this." Jareth shook his head, a subtle gesture that conveyed not anger, but awareness. "Life doesn't give us the luxury of planning for betrayal. But it does give us a choice. And I choose to reclaim myself, Selah. This is not the end of me, not the end of my life. Not the end of who I am." And in that moment, as the late afternoon sunlight poured through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow that belied the storm of emotions between them, Jareth realized something profound. The betrayal was only the beginning, not of despair, but of a journey toward a new kind of strength. One forged not in dominance or intimidation, but in resilience, clarity, and an unshakable commitment to self. After Selah left the kitchen, her footsteps retreating down the hallway, Jareth remained standing amidst the lingering scent of their evening. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the hardwood floor under the subtle weight of the house settling. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, eyes unfocused yet inwardly calculating, as if the world outside the kitchen had dissolved entirely, leaving him alone with the raw, unfiltered reality of betrayal. The phone still rested where she had left it, but he didn't touch it this time. It was no longer a source of immediate anger, instead, it had become a symbol, a catalyst forcing him to confront truths he had perhaps long avoided. He sank into a chair, the polished surface cool against his palms, and allowed himself a long, slow exhale. He thought of the man, Thorne Kincaid, whose name had now become synonymous with intrusion, desire, and dominance. The term alpha male echoed relentlessly in his mind, but its meaning was now distorted, stripped of its allure and replaced by a challenge. It was not just a challenge to his marriage, it was a challenge to his identity, to the man he had believed himself to be. For the first time in years, Jareth scrutinized the life he had grown comfortable with, the routines, the small comforts, the predictability. There was nothing inherently wrong with stability, he realized, but he acknowledged with brutal honesty that he had allowed it to dull his edge, to obscure the parts of himself that once burned with ambition, drive, and purpose. He had been a man content to walk a well-worn path, never questioning, never pushing, never truly confronting the boundaries of his own potential. And now, with the intrusion of Thorne into his world, those boundaries had been thrust into stark relief. The first stirrings of resolve came not as a sudden flare of anger, but as a slow, deliberate ignition within him. He would not allow this violation of trust to define the rest of his life. Not with Thorne, not with Selah, and certainly not with himself. He realized, as the late afternoon light slanted across the kitchen, that the strength he sought would not be found in confrontation alone. It would be forged in self-mastery, in clarity of thought, in preparation, and in the unyielding cultivation of both mind and body. Jareth began to make lists, mentally at first, then scribbled on a notepad he retrieved from the drawer. Physical fitness. Strategic thinking. Legal knowledge. Emotional resilience. Networking. These were no longer abstract concepts, they were pillars of his impending transformation. Each item represented a tangible action, a step toward reclaiming the narrative of his life and redefining what it meant to be strong. He knew that if he approached this as a reactionary struggle, as a game of emotional dominance, he would lose. But if he approached it as a deliberate, calculated process, he could control the outcome. The hours stretched into evening, and Jareth found himself walking through the house in quiet contemplation. He paused at photographs on the walls, trips to distant cities, birthday celebrations, candid moments of laughter with Selah. Each image carried the weight of memory, both comforting and painful. He did not erase them from his mind, he absorbed them, acknowledging the history they represented while understanding that the future would demand a different version of himself. It was not about erasing the past but about learning from it, about transforming pain into purpose. He considered the idea of seeking advice, reaching out to those he trusted. There were friends, allies, and mentors he had neglected in the lull of marital comfort. A lawyer from his college days who had always championed logic and foresight. A former military friend who understood resilience, discipline, and the unspoken rules of endurance. A counselor capable of guiding him through emotional turbulence without judgment. He resolved to consult them all, to assemble a framework not just for dealing with the immediate crisis, but for reconstructing a life of purpose, strength, and self-determination. By the time night had fallen, Jareth had established a preliminary strategy. His mind was no longer clouded by anger or despair, it was sharpened, honed into a precise instrument. The betrayal, he realized, had not weakened him, it had awakened him. He would not be defined by Selah's choices, nor by Thorn's presence. He would define himself through deliberate action, through preparation, through the relentless pursuit of competence and mastery. Sitting at the edge of his bed, Jareth allowed a brief moment of reflection. He could still feel the sting of betrayal, the ache of loss, but he felt something else, too, a glimmer of anticipation, an emerging sense of empowerment. This was not merely about reclaiming Selah or confronting Thorn. It was about reclaiming himself. About establishing a life where he set the terms, where his identity was dictated not by others' actions but by his own choices. As he finally lay down, the city lights twinkling faintly through the blinds, Jareth made a silent promise, he would rise above this. He would become stronger, smarter, and more resilient. Not for vengeance, not for validation, but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the life he now built would be anchored in integrity, intelligence, and true strength. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of that journey, a path defined by self-discipline, strategy, and the unshakable resolve to reclaim everything he had nearly lost, not just his marriage, but his identity, his confidence, and his purpose. And in that calm, almost meditative moment, Jareth Calloway realized the profound truth: the measure of a man was not in how he was perceived by others, nor in the dominance he could exert, but in the resilience he demonstrated when confronted with betrayal, adversity, and the unanticipated storms of life. The next morning, Jareth woke with a sense of purpose that felt heavier than any sleep-deprived lethargy he had ever known. The betrayal lingered in his mind like a shadow, but it was no longer paralyzing, it was fuel. Today, he would meet Thorn Kincaid, the man who had disrupted the very foundation of his life. He dressed deliberately, choosing a dark tailored suit that conveyed quiet confidence rather than aggression, a subtle reminder that strength could be understated and precise. When he arrived at his home's front door, the knock came unexpectedly, deliberate and assertive. Jareth's pulse quickened, not out of fear, but anticipation. He opened the door to find Thorn standing there, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that seemed to dominate the very air around him. His hair, dark and meticulously styled, caught the sunlight, and his piercing blue eyes held a predator's intensity. He was everything Selah had described: alpha, commanding, almost unnervingly confident. "Jareth Calloway," Thorn said, his voice deep, resonant, and carefully measured. "We need to talk." There was no greeting, no small talk, only a direct assertion of his presence, a calculated entrance into the man's domain. Jareth stepped aside, silently inviting him in, though he felt no obligation to submit to intimidation. Curiosity, clarity, and resolve had replaced any instinct to shrink back. They entered the living room, the space once filled with laughter and quiet domesticity now transformed into an arena of confrontation. Thorne's gaze swept over the room, noting every photograph, every personal artifact, every trace of the life Jareth had built. It was as though he were measuring not only the man before him, but the environment he had claimed. Thorne sat first, shoulders back, exuding dominance with every movement. "I know what you're thinking," he began, voice smooth but edged with subtle menace. "You think I've come here to brag, to gloat, or to assert some kind of victory over your marriage. You're mistaken. I'm here to make the terms clear." Jareth listened quietly, his eyes fixed on Thorne, neither flinching nor showing the slightest sign of intimidation. He observed the other man, every twitch of the jaw, every controlled movement, every subtle flicker of pride or insecurity. He recognized that dominance, while impressive, was often a mask, a performance carefully maintained to intimidate others. Thorne leaned forward slightly. "Selah is happier with me. She needs someone who can match her energy, her drive, her vitality. You've been comfortable, predictable. That's fine for some, but she deserves more. You have a choice: accept it, let her see me on the side, or step aside completely. And if you refuse either, well, life can get very complicated for you." Jareth remained seated, posture relaxed, breathing measured. The audacity of Thorne's ultimatum would have struck any ordinary man with fear. But Jareth had spent months preparing for this confrontation in his mind, strategizing how to respond with intelligence rather than anger. He allowed the words to hang in the air, acknowledging the threat without succumbing to it. "You really think you can dictate terms in my home?" Jareth said calmly, voice even, deliberate. "That because you can intimidate someone with your presence, your posture, your choice of words, you control the outcome? You misjudge me." He leaned forward slightly, letting the subtle weight of his confidence press against the room. "I've been the quiet one for years. I've nurtured, I've built, I've chosen when and where to fight. And now, you've chosen to be my opponent." Thorne's expression flickered, a momentary crack in the mask of composure, then hardened again. "You're bluffing. You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, voice low, edged with subtle threat. Jareth's response was unwavering. "I know enough. I've taken steps, prepared for every possibility, and most importantly, I know my own strength. Being an alpha isn't about intimidation or control. It's about leadership, integrity, and the ability to act decisively when it matters most. That's what I am. And that's what you're about to learn." The room was thick with tension, the kind that makes the air feel heavier, the seconds stretch longer, each moment pregnant with unspoken challenges. Thorne shifted in his seat, a predator assessing a prey that refused to cower. For the first time, he seemed unsure, not of Jareth's capabilities, but of the certainty of the intimidation he had relied upon for so long. "You think you can intimidate me with words?" Thorne said, attempting to regain control, though the edge in his voice had dulled slightly. Jareth shook his head slowly, measured. "I don't need to intimidate. I've already taken the necessary steps to secure my life. My legal protections, my alliances, and my preparations mean that you no longer control the narrative. Your attempt to dominate me here, in my home, in my life, it's already failing." Thorne's jaw clenched, and a faint flicker of disbelief passed through his eyes. Jareth held his gaze, unflinching, calm, and precise. Every detail of his demeanor, every choice of posture, every measured breath, signaled a single truth: he was no longer the man who could be overshadowed or threatened. Finally, Thorne rose, the motion deliberate, signaling the end of the meeting for now. "Think carefully, Jareth. This isn't over," he said, voice low but carrying the weight of a veiled threat. Jareth nodded, not in submission, but acknowledgement. "I'll be ready. Not just for you, but for myself." As the door closed behind Thorne, a profound clarity settled over Jareth. He was no longer just the betrayed husband. He was a man forging a new identity, one built on intelligence, resilience, and an unshakable commitment to his own principles. The confrontation had not intimidated him, it had awakened him, crystallizing the path he would now walk, a path of strategy, preparation, and undeniable strength. After Thorn left, the house was silent in a way that felt almost surreal. The echo of the door closing lingered, reverberating through the empty rooms, and Jareth sat down heavily in the armchair by the living room window. The sunlight had begun to fade, giving way to a warm, amber glow that filtered through the blinds. It was a calm that contrasted sharply with the storm of emotions still churning inside him. Anger, disappointment, betrayal, all were present, but they no longer held the power to dictate his next move. Instead, a deeper sense of clarity emerged, a recognition that the confrontation had been less about Thorn and more about defining his own strength and agency. Jareth stared at the floor, letting his mind replay the meeting in meticulous detail. Thorn's every word, every gesture, every calculated attempt at dominance had been observed, catalogued, and analyzed. It wasn't enough to react emotionally, Jareth knew that would be predictable, exploitable. He needed to be strategic. The confrontation had exposed not only Thorn's arrogance, but also vulnerabilities, subtle cracks in the armor of confidence that Jareth could leverage, not through brute force, but through careful planning and precise execution. He pulled out a notebook, the same one he had begun using in the wake of Selah's betrayal. Page after page was filled with observations, potential strategies, contingencies, and reflections on his own weaknesses and strengths. Today, those notes would evolve into a more comprehensive plan. The first step, Jareth realized, was to fortify his personal foundation. Physical strength, while important, was only a component. Mental acuity, emotional resilience, and strategic foresight were equally critical. He made a list of priorities: fitness regimen, skill acquisition, legal consultation, and intelligence gathering. Each item was not a mere task, but a pillar in the construction of a new identity. As he wrote, Jareth's mind wandered back to Selah. The pain of betrayal was undeniable, yet he recognized that resentment could be transformed into motivation. This was not about punishing her or Thorn, it was about reclaiming control over the narrative of his life. His thoughts circled around the concept of leadership, the kind that commanded respect not through fear, but through competence and integrity. He resolved that whatever unfolded with Thorn, he would conduct himself with unshakable composure, refusing to be manipulated or coerced. Jareth considered the legal dimensions of the situation. He had already consulted a lawyer regarding potential protective measures and steps to secure his assets. Now, he resolved to deepen that knowledge, understanding every possible angle from which Thorn might attempt to exert influence or cause disruption. He made a mental note to review local laws, consult with additional experts, and document every interaction meticulously. This was not paranoia, it was preparation, an extension of the strategic mindset that had begun to define him. Evenings were spent in disciplined routine. Physical training became a ritual of reclamation, each repetition a testament to his commitment to self-improvement. Strength and endurance were no longer just measures of capability, they were manifestations of control over his own body and mind. He incorporated martial arts, not for confrontation, but for mental fortitude and discipline. Each session was an exercise in focus, patience, and resilience, cultivating a calm power that could not be shaken by intimidation or circumstance. Simultaneously, Jareth invested in mental development. He read extensively on strategy, negotiation, psychology, and leadership. He immersed himself in historical accounts of individuals who had overcome adversity through intellect and planning rather than aggression. Every book, every lesson became another tool, another edge sharpened in the preparation for the challenges ahead. Knowledge, he realized, was as formidable a weapon as any physical skill, and his arsenal was growing exponentially. Reflection also became a cornerstone of his transformation. Jareth spent hours alone, assessing his own responses, evaluating past choices, and identifying the complacencies that had allowed the rift between him and Selah to widen unnoticed. He was honest with himself about the areas in which he had allowed comfort to override ambition, and he used these insights to guide the restructuring of his life. Self-awareness, he understood, was not a luxury, it was a strategic necessity. By the end of the day, Jareth had drafted a multi-layered plan. It was not a plan of revenge, nor one driven by malice. It was a plan of reclamation, empowerment, and foresight. He would address Thorn's intrusion, safeguard his personal and professional life, and fortify himself against future disruptions. More importantly, he would rebuild his identity, anchored in resilience, intelligence, and unshakable self-respect. As night settled over the city, Jareth allowed himself a quiet moment of satisfaction. He was no longer merely reacting to events, he was shaping them. The confrontation had illuminated the path ahead, and he now stepped onto it with deliberate intent. The journey would be arduous, and challenges were inevitable, but he faced them not with fear or anger, but with clarity and determination. The first steps had been taken, and for the first time since the betrayal, Jareth felt a profound sense of empowerment. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring action. He would begin engaging with allies, refining his strategies, and preparing for the eventual next encounter with Thorn. But tonight, he allowed himself a rare moment of calm, confident in the knowledge that he had already begun the transformation from a man constrained by circumstance to one who commanded his own destiny. The following morning, Jareth awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The confrontation with Thorn had revealed the parameters of the challenge ahead, and now it was time to move from reflection to action. He began by reviewing his notes, which were already a detailed map of observations, strategies, and contingencies. Each point, each nuance of Thorn's behavior, was carefully documented, the slight twitch when he felt challenged, the precise cadence of his speech, the subtle arrogance in his posture. These details, which might seem trivial to an outsider, were vital tools for constructing a strategic advantage. Jareth knew that Thorn thrived on intimidation and control, leveraging both charm and fear to bend situations to his favor. To counteract this, Jareth resolved that his approach would combine foresight, intelligence, and calm decisiveness. Physical confrontation might be expected, but it would play into Thorn's strengths. Instead, Jareth's strategy would focus on legal preparation, intelligence gathering, and psychological positioning. It was a battle that required patience, subtlety, and precision, qualities that Jareth had been cultivating for weeks. He started by analyzing his immediate environment. Every personal and professional detail, assets, documents, correspondence, digital footprints, was organized and secured. Jareth made copies of critical documents, encrypted sensitive information, and ensured that any potential leverage Thorn might attempt to wield could be neutralized. The house, once a place of domestic tranquility, became a headquarters for preparation, each room methodically assessed and optimized for focus and efficiency. Next, Jareth turned to his network of allies. He contacted his lawyer friend, a methodical and strategic thinker who had already provided guidance on protective measures. They discussed potential legal avenues, including restraining orders, asset protection, and documentation of any interactions that could later be used as evidence. The goal was not revenge, but security, ensuring that Thorn could no longer manipulate or threaten him with impunity. Jareth also reached out to a former military colleague, someone who had endured adversity under extreme conditions. The conversations were less about physical tactics and more about mental resilience and situational awareness. They discussed methods for maintaining composure under pressure, reading body language to anticipate threats, and cultivating a mindset that balanced caution with decisive action. Each discussion added another layer to Jareth's preparation, reinforcing his confidence and expanding his toolkit for the challenges ahead. Physical preparation remained crucial. Jareth's workouts had evolved beyond simple fitness routines into disciplined regimens designed to enhance strength, endurance, and focus. Martial arts training became central, emphasizing mental discipline and controlled execution rather than aggression. Each session was an exercise in patience and observation, training him to respond thoughtfully and strategically rather than react impulsively. As the day progressed, Jareth began to construct a psychological profile of Thorn. He recalled every detail from their previous encounter, the overconfidence, the subtle cracks, the attempts at manipulation. By understanding Thorne's patterns, Jareth could anticipate potential moves, predict emotional responses, and strategically navigate any future confrontation. This mental exercise became a cornerstone of his plan, preparation not just in the physical and legal realms, but in the subtle interplay of psychology and human behavior. Jareth also considered alliances beyond his immediate circle. While Selah had complicated the personal dimension of the situation, he realized that information and insight from others who had interacted with Thorne could provide invaluable leverage. Discreetly, he began reaching out to mutual contacts, gathering details and corroborating accounts that painted a comprehensive picture of Thorne's behavior, tendencies, and vulnerabilities. This was intelligence work, carefully conducted, ensuring that no move was made without awareness and documentation. Evening fell, and Jareth moved to the kitchen, sitting at the table with his notebook open. The glow of the city lights filtered through the windows, casting shadows across the pages filled with meticulous notes and action points. He reviewed each element of his strategy, adjusting priorities, refining contingencies, and rehearsing scenarios in his mind. It was not enough to have a plan, he needed to be so familiar with it that execution would be instinctive, precise, and effective. By nightfall, Jareth had constructed a multi-layered approach that balanced preparation, intelligence, and psychological leverage. He would meet challenges strategically, mitigate risks through documentation and legal channels, and cultivate an aura of calm competence that Thorne could not easily intimidate. The plan was thorough, deliberate, and methodical, reflecting the transformation he had undergone since the first revelation of Selah's betrayal. Finally, Jareth allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The confrontation with Thorne, once a source of fear and uncertainty, had become an opportunity for growth and empowerment. The path ahead was challenging, but he felt no dread, only anticipation, focus, and a profound sense of control. He understood that the coming days would test not only his preparation but his patience, resilience, and strategic thinking. And he was ready. As he closed the notebook, he whispered to himself, a quiet affirmation of the journey ahead, "I define the terms of my life. Not him. Not anyone else. I do." The words resonated through the room, a silent declaration of intent, signaling the beginning of the next phase. The battle was no longer about domination, it was about strategy, preparation, and the assertion of unshakable self-mastery. The day had a crisp edge to it, the kind of morning where clarity and focus seem almost tangible in the air. Jareth awoke with a single objective, to begin implementing the strategies he had meticulously developed over the past weeks. The confrontation with Thorne had been a warning, a test of composure and mental acuity. Now, it was time to translate preparation into action, to move from the theoretical into the practical. He started with his home office, a space that had become the nerve center of his operations. The desk was organized with precise intent, documents meticulously categorized, digital files encrypted and backed up, and every piece of potential leverage systematically indexed. Jareth reviewed each contact he had reached out to, mapping connections, gathering corroborating statements, and identifying critical information that could substantiate future legal and strategic moves. The process was methodical, almost ritualistic, reinforcing a mindset of calm precision. By mid-morning, Jareth reached out to his lawyer. The conversation was brief but comprehensive, a review of the legal groundwork laid to counter Thorne's potential manipulations. Protective measures were confirmed, restraining orders in place, asset safeguards enacted, and contingencies for any attempt to intimidate or coerce fully prepared. Jareth's lawyer emphasized documentation, every interaction, every message, every action should be logged, time-stamped, and verifiable. Jareth noted each point carefully, understanding that discipline and thoroughness were just as critical as any physical or strategic preparation. Next, he turned to physical readiness. Jareth's workout that morning was rigorous yet precise. It was not a display of strength, but a reinforcement of mental discipline. Each motion was deliberate, each breath controlled, each repetition a reaffirmation of his resilience. Martial arts exercises, particularly those focused on control and situational awareness, became central. Every block, strike, and movement was a practice in mental composure, conditioning him to respond thoughtfully under pressure rather than react impulsively. By noon, Jareth had arranged to meet a trusted ally who had first-hand experience with Thorne's pattern of behavior. The meeting was discreet, held in a quiet cafe removed from the public eye. Jareth listened carefully as his contact detailed specific manipulations Thorne had employed in prior relationships, psychological intimidation, subtle coercion, and patterns of escalating control. Each account reinforced the intelligence Jareth had already gathered and illuminated new vulnerabilities in Thorne's behavior. This knowledge would be pivotal in guiding his next steps, ensuring that every move was calculated rather than reactive. Armed with this intelligence, Jareth mapped out his initial course of action. He identified key points of leverage, potential legal avenues, and psychological strategies designed to neutralize Thorne's advantage. He would act strategically, exposing threats without escalating conflict unnecessarily. Every step was intended to reinforce his own position while limiting opportunities for Thorne to assert dominance or manipulate outcomes. Afternoon came, and Jareth executed the first tangible element of his plan, discreetly notifying local authorities and legal representatives of Thorne's documented patterns of behavior. This was not about immediate confrontation but preemptive positioning. By establishing a record of concern, Jareth created a protective layer around himself, reinforcing that any aggressive or coercive action by Thorne would meet prepared resistance, backed by legal authority. Simultaneously, Jareth reached out to select community contacts, individuals whose insight and experience could provide additional support and verification. These were people who could observe interactions, corroborate accounts, and contribute to a network of awareness that made Thorne's attempts to manipulate or intimidate less effective. Each conversation was conducted with discretion, carefully framing the narrative to protect confidentiality while ensuring strategic advantage. Evening fell, and Jareth moved to consolidate the day's efforts. He reviewed every document, every note, every piece of intelligence gathered. Each element of the plan was cross-referenced, potential contingencies updated, and next steps carefully plotted. He rehearsed scenarios mentally, visualizing interactions, anticipating responses, and considering alternative outcomes. This exercise was not merely theoretical, it was preparation for immediate action, ensuring that he could respond with calm decisiveness under pressure. As night deepened, Jareth allowed a brief pause to reflect. The plan was in motion, each element carefully positioned to counter Thorne's influence and protect his autonomy. He felt a profound sense of agency. He was no longer merely reacting to threats, but actively shaping the course of events. The confrontation that had once loomed as a source of anxiety was now a catalyst, transforming fear into strategy and uncertainty into calculated action. Finally, Jareth closed his notebook, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. The first steps had been taken, the foundation for the next phase, direct confrontation under controlled conditions, was secure. He understood that challenges lay ahead, that Thorne would undoubtedly respond, but he was no longer unprepared or overwhelmed. The combination of legal foresight, physical discipline, psychological acuity, and strategic planning had created a position of strength that could not be easily undermined. As he gazed out the window at the city lights flickering against the darkness, Jareth felt a clarity and calm that had eluded him since the initial betrayal. The path forward was demanding, but it was now a path of his own making. And with that realization, he prepared himself for the next stage, the execution of a plan that would redefine not only his standing but his own understanding of strength, resilience, and control. The next morning, Jareth awoke with the same sharp clarity he had cultivated over the past weeks. Today's focus was not on immediate confrontation, but on expanding the network of allies and intelligence that would provide both protection and strategic advantage. While the initial groundwork had been laid, legal preparations, intelligence gathering, and physical conditioning, the complexity of Thorne's behavior required a broader perspective. Allies, both known and potential, were essential to ensure that no maneuver went unnoticed or unanticipated. Jareth began by reviewing the contact list he had compiled over the previous months. Each name represented a potential asset, a source of information, a voice of experience, or a strategic partner who could reinforce his position. He prioritized individuals who had first-hand knowledge of Thorne's patterns, those who could provide insight into his manipulations, and those capable of observing interactions without raising suspicion. Discretion was paramount. Any overt action risked tipping Thorne off to the strategy being developed. By mid-morning, Jareth reached out to a trusted former colleague from his previous work assignments, someone who had a keen understanding of human behavior and negotiation tactics. They met in a quiet cafe, exchanging information with careful precision. Jareth presented the documented behaviors and communications he had gathered, while his colleague provided additional observations and tactical advice. Together, they identified subtle vulnerabilities in Thorne's approach, tendencies toward overconfidence, predictable patterns of emotional provocation, and blind spots that could be leveraged to minimize risk and maximize control. After the meeting, Jareth considered the more delicate task, re-establishing contact with Selah. Their relationship had been fractured by betrayal, yet her perspective remained crucial. He understood that approaching her required a blend of empathy, strategic communication, and careful observation. The goal was not to rekindle romance or invite emotional entanglement, but to understand her current position, gather information on Thorne's movements, and subtly assess whether she could become an ally in a more controlled, rational capacity. The meeting was arranged at a neutral location, a quiet park on the outskirts of the city where conversation could occur without prying eyes or unintended interruptions. Jareth arrived early, choosing a bench under a large oak tree, its branches casting a lattice of shadows across the ground. When Selah arrived, her expression was guarded yet curious. She approached with tentative steps, the familiarity of her presence tempered by months of tension and distance. "Jareth," she began, her voice carefully measured, "I wasn't sure you'd agree to meet." "I've changed," Jareth replied evenly, not allowing emotion to color his tone. "And so has the situation. I wanted to understand where things stand, and perhaps help you see the reality of what we're dealing with." Selah nodded, hesitant, her eyes scanning his expression for hidden motives. Jareth remained composed, letting silence underscore the gravity of their interaction. He recounted the documented behaviors, the strategies he had begun implementing, and the potential risks posed by Thorne, not with accusation, but with clear, factual presentation. He emphasized that the goal was not vengeance but self-preservation, legal protection, and strategic foresight. As the conversation unfolded, Selah revealed additional insights, details about Thorne's habits, his subtle manipulations, and his attempts to assert control over multiple facets of her life. Each piece of information, though delivered cautiously, provided critical context. Jareth listened, absorbing every nuance, while maintaining an air of calm authority. He asked precise questions, seeking confirmation and clarification, ensuring that each answer contributed to a broader strategic understanding. By the afternoon, Jareth had not only gathered valuable intelligence but also established a tentative rapport with Selah. She was no longer merely a source of emotional complexity, she had become a controlled conduit of information. Her awareness of Thorne's manipulations, coupled with Jareth's meticulous documentation and strategic acumen, created a formidable combination. They agreed to maintain discreet communication, sharing observations and insights as situations evolved. With this strengthened network, Jareth felt a subtle but important shift in confidence. The strategy was no longer unilateral, it had expanded to include carefully vetted allies capable of providing support, corroboration, and tactical perspective. Every interaction was documented, every insight logged, creating a dynamic intelligence framework that could adapt to Thorne's next move. Evening arrived, and Jareth returned home to consolidate the day's efforts. Notes from the cafe meeting, Selah's observations, and the additional intelligence gathered were meticulously organized. He updated contingency plans, revised priorities, and rehearsed potential scenarios mentally. The process was not merely administrative, it was an exercise in mental conditioning, reinforcing the calm decisiveness that had become his defining strength. Before retiring for the night, Jareth reflected on the progress made. The confrontation with Thorne had initially appeared daunting, almost insurmountable. But through preparation, strategic networking, and disciplined action, he had transformed uncertainty into opportunity. Each ally added not just information, but a buffer of security and perspective. Each piece of intelligence increased the precision of his response, ensuring that future interactions with Thorn would occur on his terms, not those dictated by fear or manipulation. As he gazed out at the city skyline, the lights shimmering against the darkened sky, Jareth allowed himself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. The path ahead was still challenging, but he now possessed clarity, strategy, and an expanding network of allies. The next stage would involve deeper engagement with Thorn, leveraging intelligence, psychological positioning, and tactical foresight. For the first time since the betrayal, Jareth felt truly prepared to navigate the complex landscape before him. The days following his meetings with Sayla and other allies were spent in meticulous planning. Jareth understood that the next step, direct engagement with Thorn, required not just courage, but precision, timing, and psychological awareness. Every possible outcome had to be anticipated, every variable considered, and every move calculated. This was not a confrontation of brute force, but a battle of intellect, preparation, and control. He began by reviewing all gathered intelligence. Selah's observations, corroborated by prior accounts from mutual acquaintances and his own documented experiences, painted a comprehensive picture of Thorn's behavioral patterns. There were moments of arrogance that could be exploited, predictable emotional triggers, and blind spots born from overconfidence. Jareth made a detailed profile, noting not just Thorn's strengths but the subtle weaknesses hidden beneath his imposing presence. Next, Jareth examined his own position. He reviewed legal protections, secured sensitive information, and reinforced communication lines with allies who could provide support or evidence in real time. Physical preparedness remained important, though it was secondary to mental acuity. Martial arts exercises continued, emphasizing focus, control, and the ability to respond calmly under pressure. Each session was a reminder that strength was not only physical, but mental and emotional, a message he intended to convey during the upcoming encounter. With the groundwork in place, Jareth began to script potential scenarios. He anticipated the kinds of provocations Thorn might use: intimidation, verbal manipulation, feigned dominance. Each scenario was analyzed for possible responses, ensuring that his actions would always maintain strategic advantage. Jareth rehearsed dialogue silently, visualizing how he would assert control without aggression, how he would communicate strength, confidence, and unshakable composure. The next stage involved selecting a location for the engagement. Jareth wanted neutral territory, a space where he could control the environment while minimizing risk. He considered cafes, parks, and private offices, ultimately choosing a mid-sized, quiet meeting room in a downtown office building. The location allowed for discretion, security, and the option to involve mediators if necessary. Jareth's goal was not confrontation for its own sake, but controlled dialogue that could shift the psychological balance in his favor. He also devised a layered approach for arrival and engagement. Timing was critical. Arriving early would provide a psychological edge, giving him space to observe Thorn before the interaction began. Allies would be on standby, not as direct participants, but as a safety net and source of additional verification if Thorn attempted manipulation or escalation. Every detail was calculated: seating arrangements, line of sight, potential exits, and even the subtle cues of body language that could influence perception. Jareth dedicated considerable attention to framing his objectives. The engagement was not about intimidation or revenge, it was about asserting control over his own narrative. He would communicate clearly, calmly, and with authority. The goal was to establish dominance through intelligence, composure, and foresight, rather than aggression. Every word, every gesture, every pause was to be deliberate, reinforcing his presence as a man who could navigate adversity with clarity and strength. He also considered contingency measures. What if Thorn became aggressive? What if attempts at intimidation escalated? Jareth prepared multiple exit strategies, communication protocols, and immediate legal actions. He briefed his allies, ensuring they understood their roles, the signals for intervention, and the precise boundaries of engagement. Nothing was left to chance, the psychological terrain was as carefully mapped as any battlefield. Evening arrived, and Jareth spent hours visualizing the encounter. He imagined Thorn's entrance, his body language, the potential smirks and calculated threats. In his mind, Jareth rehearsed his responses, testing tone, cadence, and facial expressions. He refined each phrase to convey authority without aggression, confidence without arrogance, and intelligence without condescension. It was an exercise in mental discipline, ensuring that when the moment arrived, instinct and strategy would align seamlessly. By nightfall, the plan was complete. Jareth reviewed every document, every note, and every observation once more, making minor adjustments based on the day's reflections. He allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction, not arrogance, but calm confidence. He was prepared, methodical, and psychologically equipped to engage Thorn directly. The confrontation would not be a test of strength alone, but of strategy, composure, and the ability to assert control over his own life. Finally, Jareth reflected on the journey that had led him here. From betrayal to preparation, from analysis to strategic alliances, every step had been designed to transform fear into power and uncertainty into control. The encounter with Thorn was imminent, but it was no longer intimidating. It was an opportunity, a carefully structured stage where intellect, resilience, and strategic foresight would determine the outcome. As he closed his notebook and gazed at the city lights flickering in the distance, Jareth whispered to himself, a quiet affirmation of intent, "I define the terms of this encounter. Not him. I do." The words resonated, a declaration of ownership over the situation and over his own life, marking the threshold of a confrontation that would test every facet of his preparation. The day of the confrontation arrived with a crisp, clear sky, the sunlight cutting sharply through the city streets. Jareth approached the building with measured steps, his mind focused and unshakably calm. Every preparation, every scenario rehearsal, and every intelligence briefing led to this moment. It was time to meet Thorn directly, not with fear, but with control, strategy, and purpose. Entering the building, Jareth was acutely aware of every detail, the polished floors, the echo of footsteps, the subtle hum of activity. He arrived early, as planned, and chose a seat where he could observe both entrances and exits. This vantage point allowed him to monitor Thorn's arrival and establish psychological dominance through patience and composure. Allies remained on standby, discreetly nearby, a silent buffer to ensure the engagement remained under control. When Thorn entered, he was predictably imposing, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a confidence that suggested he believed the world bent to his will. His eyes scanned the room, seeking signs of weakness, a crack in the composure he had come to dominate. Instead, he found Jareth seated calmly, posture straight, gaze unwavering. The contrast was subtle but unmistakable, the predator met a calculated force, not a trembling victim. "Jareth," Thorn began, voice low, attempting a tone of casual authority. "I see you've been busy." "Yes," Jareth replied evenly, his voice calm but firm. "I've been preparing, as you should expect when dealing with someone who refuses to be intimidated." Thorn's smirk flickered, a brief lapse in the carefully constructed facade of control. He adjusted his stance, attempting to regain psychological superiority, leaning slightly forward. "I hope you understand what you're getting into. Some choices are bigger than you realize." "I do," Jareth said, his eyes steady, never flinching. "And that's why I'm here on my terms, not yours." The initial exchange set the tone. Thorn attempted subtle provocations, insinuations, casual threats, and reminders of perceived superiority. But Jareth responded with precision, neutralizing each tactic with calm reasoning, factual references, and unwavering composure. He referenced documented interactions, legal protections in place, and observations from allies, all conveyed with clarity that left little room for manipulation. Thorn tried to pivot, using charm and intimidation in tandem. He spoke of influence, charisma, and the loyalty of others. But Jareth countered each assertion with measured acknowledgement and factual reinforcement, showing neither fear nor emotional reaction. The power dynamic shifted subtly but decisively, Thorn's energy, previously dominant, met a counterforce of strategy and self-possession. Jareth's approach was deliberate. He did not seek confrontation for its own sake, nor did he attempt to provoke a reaction. Every word was chosen to assert control, every pause calculated to maintain psychological balance. He highlighted patterns of behavior, noting inconsistencies and vulnerabilities without accusation, demonstrating that knowledge and preparedness could offset physical dominance. The conversation moved to practical considerations. Jareth outlined potential outcomes for all parties, emphasizing fairness, legality, and mutual accountability. Thorn, used to dictating terms through fear, found his assumptions challenged. Jareth presented contingency plans, documented evidence, and clear boundaries, making it unmistakably clear that any aggressive maneuver would be met with immediate, coordinated response. Throughout the exchange, Jareth maintained a calm, deliberate presence. He modulated tone, posture, and eye contact to convey strength without hostility. Subtle psychological cues reinforced authority, measured gestures, unbroken eye contact, and confident spacing that communicated readiness and composure. Thorn's attempts to dominate through presence and intimidation began to falter, met consistently by Jareth's disciplined, controlled demeanor. After nearly an hour, the engagement reached its decisive stage. Jareth summarized his objectives: autonomy, control of his own narrative, and the establishment of clear boundaries. He did not seek revenge, he sought balance, justice, and resolution on his terms. Thorn, visibly frustrated by the lack of compliance and the erosion of assumed dominance, attempted one final manipulation, a veiled threat aimed at provoking fear. Jareth's response was precise and unwavering. He acknowledged the threat, referenced legal and strategic measures, and emphasized that continued aggression would only reinforce his own preparedness. The calm certainty in Jareth's voice and the methodical evidence he presented left Thorn with little room to maneuver, effectively neutralizing the intended psychological impact. By the end of the meeting, the dynamic had shifted entirely. Jareth had transformed the encounter from a potential site of intimidation into a controlled, strategic engagement. Thorn exited, visibly unsettled, aware that his usual tactics were ineffective against a man who had prepared meticulously, maintained composure, and leveraged intelligence as his primary weapon. As Jareth watched Thorn leave, he felt a quiet satisfaction, not triumph in the conventional sense, but a deeper understanding of control, strength, and resilience. The confrontation had not been won through force or aggression, but through preparation, psychological insight, and the disciplined execution of a plan. He had reasserted agency over his life, and in doing so, had set the stage for all subsequent actions to unfold on his terms. Returning to his own space, Jareth reflected on the encounter. It had been a test of intellect, patience, and emotional regulation. Every step had been deliberate, every reaction controlled, and every observation logged for future reference. The direct engagement had proven that power was not always defined by physical presence, but by strategy, composure, and the ability to navigate complex human dynamics with precision. As night fell, Jareth allowed himself a rare moment of calm reflection. The confrontation with Thorn marked a turning point, a shift from reactive defensiveness to proactive control. He had faced the challenge directly, maintained his integrity, and established a framework for continued strategic action. This encounter, while tense and fraught with risk, underscored a fundamental truth: true strength lies in preparation, intelligence, and the unwavering command of one's own narrative. In the days following the confrontation, Jareth focused on consolidating the network of allies and evidence he had meticulously gathered. The direct engagement with Thorn had confirmed not only his own preparedness but also revealed subtleties in Thorn's behavior: overconfidence, impatience, and predictable responses under perceived challenge. These traits, combined with Selah's insider knowledge, provided the framework for a coordinated strategy aimed at exposing Thorn's manipulations and ensuring accountability. Jareth arranged a discreet meeting with Selah in a quiet, neutral space, an unassuming co-working lounge where conversation could occur without interruption. He reviewed the materials she had gathered: communications, photographs, financial discrepancies, and detailed accounts of patterns of coercion. Each piece of evidence was scrutinized for reliability and relevance. The goal was clear: build an airtight, comprehensive dossier that could withstand scrutiny from both legal authorities and potential media outlets. Together, they cross-referenced their observations, filling gaps and verifying inconsistencies. Selah's accounts added layers of context that Jareth had previously lacked, revealing patterns in Thorne's interactions with others, his methods of control, manipulation, and intimidation that extended beyond personal relationships. The picture emerging was not simply that of a domineering individual, but of someone who systematically exploited vulnerabilities for personal gain. Jareth's analytical mind translated this growing body of evidence into actionable steps. He categorized each piece according to type: emotional manipulation, financial misconduct, coercion, and potential legal infractions. This structured approach ensured that when the time came to present the case, it would be coherent, compelling, and difficult to dispute. Allies were briefed on roles, and communication channels were established to ensure confidentiality and rapid response if Thorne attempted countermeasures. While legal considerations remained paramount, Jareth recognized the value of public awareness. He initiated careful discussions with media contacts who specialized in investigative reporting, emphasizing the necessity of discretion and accuracy. The objective was not sensationalism, but accountability, exposing Thorne's patterns in a manner that safeguarded both sources and potential victims. Selah contributed insight into the personal impact of his manipulations, providing narratives that humanized the abstract patterns and underscored the consequences of unchecked behavior. Parallel to these strategic maneuvers, Jareth continued personal preparation. The mental and emotional fortitude cultivated over months of planning was reinforced through continued meditation, journaling, and tactical rehearsals. He visualized scenarios in which Thorne attempted to manipulate, intimidate, or discredit him, and he practiced calm, measured responses. The objective was clear: any future encounters would occur on Jareth's terms, not as reactive moments but as controlled engagements guided by strategy and foresight. As their coordination intensified, Selah also revealed the existence of other individuals affected by Thorne, former colleagues, partners, and acquaintances who had experienced similar manipulations. Jareth reached out selectively, establishing a confidential support network. Each new account added to the growing evidence, creating a multi-layered understanding of Thorne's behaviors across various domains. The network became both an information source and a psychological buffer. The awareness that they were not isolated empowered each participant to engage with clarity and resolve. The planning sessions culminated in a decision: it was time to expose Thorne publicly, in a controlled and legally secure manner. The objective was twofold: protect potential victims and ensure Thorne could no longer hide behind a facade of dominance. Jareth and Selah, together with their allies, developed a precise timeline for disclosure, ensuring all legal precautions were in place and that media presentations would emphasize factual accuracy over sensationalism. Every statement, document, and piece of evidence was vetted for clarity, impact, and defensibility. On the day of the planned disclosure, Jareth and Selah coordinated with their legal advisor, confirming that all protective measures, restraining orders, documentation, and witness corroboration, were fully operational. The public presentation was staged in a controlled environment, with journalists pre-briefed and confidentiality agreements in place. The goal was transparency and accountability, not personal vendetta, and every step was designed to reinforce that intent. When Thorne became aware of the coordinated exposure, his initial attempts at intimidation faltered. The network of evidence, allies, and legal protections created an unassailable structure. His usual tactics of coercion, fear, and manipulation were rendered ineffective. The strategy Jareth had implemented, careful preparation, controlled confrontation, and meticulous documentation, was now fully operational, demonstrating the cumulative power of foresight, intelligence, and collaborative action. As the story unfolded publicly, the reactions were immediate and profound. Individuals who had previously been silenced by fear came forward, corroborating the documented behaviors. Thorne's professional reputation and personal influence began to erode under scrutiny, while legal authorities initiated investigations supported by the meticulous records Jareth and Selah had maintained. The combination of legal, social, and public accountability created an environment in which manipulation and control could no longer persist. By evening, Jareth reflected on the day's events from a distance, observing the ripple effects of their coordinated action. The exposure was not about revenge, nor about asserting dominance, it was about justice, empowerment, and reclaiming agency. Selah's support and insight had been invaluable, transforming what could have been an isolated struggle into a strategic, multidimensional effort. Every step, every preparation, and every controlled engagement had converged to create tangible, meaningful change. Jareth realized that the outcome was not simply the exposure of Thorn, but the demonstration of resilience, intelligence, and strategic empowerment. He had transformed personal betrayal into a disciplined campaign of accountability, proving that strength is measured not by intimidation or dominance, but by preparation, integrity, and the courage to act decisively in alignment with one's principles. The days after Thorn's public unmasking unfolded like a storm slowly giving way to calm. The initial shockwaves rippled through his circles, professional, social, and personal. Colleagues who once admired his charisma now regarded him with suspicion. Former allies withdrew their support, unwilling to be associated with a man whose manipulations had been laid bare. The investigations launched by legal authorities gained traction, and soon subpoenas, inquiries, and formal hearings followed. For Jareth, the consequences were not measured in headlines but in quiet victories. He no longer felt the oppressive weight of Thorn's shadow pressing against every decision. The fear of retaliation had diminished, replaced by a steady confidence built on months of preparation and the solidarity of those who had joined his cause. What once felt like a solitary battle now became a collective stand against exploitation and deceit. Selah remained by his side throughout the aftermath. Their collaboration had forged not only trust but a sense of kinship, an unspoken bond rooted in shared struggle. They spent long evenings reflecting on the choices that had brought them here, acknowledging the pain while recognizing the strength it had cultivated. In those conversations, Jareth realized that his journey had not been about destroying Thorn but about reclaiming himself, his agency, his dignity, and his ability to shape his own narrative. The exposure also created space for others to step forward. Individuals silenced by fear began sharing their experiences, each account adding weight to the growing acknowledgement of Thorn's patterns. Jareth watched as these voices, once scattered and isolated, united into a chorus of resilience. The network he had helped foster evolved into something greater than he had imagined, a support system, an alliance dedicated not only to accountability but to healing. Yet the aftermath was not without complexity. Legal proceedings moved slowly, burdened by bureaucracy and Thorn's attempts at deflection. There were moments of frustration, days when progress seemed stalled. But Jareth approached these delays with the same discipline that had guided him through the confrontation. He journaled, meditated, and maintained the routines that reinforced his stability. Resilience was not a single act but a practice, a daily commitment to clarity and balance. As weeks turned into months, the arc of justice began to solidify. Reports surfaced that Thorn had lost professional contracts, his influence diminished in circles where reputation was currency. The investigations revealed financial misconduct and ethical breaches that extended far beyond personal relationships. Slowly, the facade he had constructed over years crumbled, leaving behind only the stark truth of manipulation and exploitation. For Jareth, however, the most profound transformation was internal. He no longer carried the quiet anger that once consumed him. Instead, he embraced a sense of purpose shaped by what he had endured. He began speaking privately with individuals navigating similar struggles, offering guidance drawn from his own journey. Without seeking the spotlight, he became a quiet mentor, demonstrating through action that betrayal and intimidation need not define one's life. One evening, sitting on a balcony overlooking the city, Jareth allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. The skyline shimmered under the fading light, a reminder of how far he had come. Selah joined him, and together they sat in silence, no longer strategizing, no longer rehearsing scenarios, but simply existing in the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. For the first time in years, Jareth felt unburdened, not because the world was free of threats, but because he had learned to face them with strength and clarity. The conclusion of his journey was not marked by triumph in the traditional sense, but by restoration. He had rebuilt the foundation of his life on integrity, resilience, and deliberate choice. The fear that once dictated his actions was gone, replaced by the understanding that true power lies not in dominance but in discipline, not in manipulation but in authenticity. Thorne's downfall, though significant, was not the centerpiece of Jareth's story. The real victory lay in transformation, turning pain into purpose, betrayal into strength, and conflict into clarity. Jareth's life was no longer a reaction to Thorne's influence, it was a deliberate creation of his own. As the night deepened, Jareth whispered words that carried the weight of closure, "It's done. And I am free." The declaration was quiet, yet it echoed louder than any confrontation, resonating with the truth of a man who had faced betrayal, endured manipulation, and emerged not only intact but empowered. The journey had been long, arduous, and often perilous. But in the end, it had given him something invaluable, the unshakable knowledge that resilience, preparation, and integrity could overcome even the most insidious forms of control. And with that understanding, Jareth stepped forward into a future no longer defined by fear, but by choice.